Thank you, everyone, and welcome back. We'll now resume our second presentation. Our speaker for this segment is Adam Kroetsch, Deputy Director, Office of Program and Strategic Analysis. Adam will discuss risk evaluation and mitigation strategies in structured product labeling format and introduction. Welcome, Adam.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you to everybody for attending today. As Ray mentioned, I'm here to talk about REMS and structured product labeling format. So to get that started, I think most of you are probably familiar with REMS, but what is SPL? We're just queuing up the next slide. We'll be ready in a second. All right, what is SPL? SPL is a data standard for capturing information about drug products, and it stands for Structured Product Labeling, but it actually covers a lot more than just labeling. For example, SPL is being used right now to register drug manufacturing facilities with the FDA, but the common thread is that it's used to capture information about drug products. SPL is not actually managed by FDA, but rather it's developed and maintained by a third-party standards development organization called Health Level 7 International, or HL7. The initial proposal to capture REMS in SPL format arose out of a commitment that we made in PDUFA 5 to seek stakeholder input and identify certain priority projects to standardize REMS. Stakeholders, and particularly another standards development organization called the National Council for Prescription Drug Programs, or NCPDP, asked FDA to pursue this as one of our priority projects to help make REMS information more standardized, more readily available, and more readily integrated into the healthcare system. And I'm going to talk in a little bit about how SPL accomplishes all of those things. But before I go into that, I also want to mention what SPL is not. SPL is a standard for product information, but it is not currently used for the exchange of patient-specific or healthcare provider-specific information. What does that mean? Well, for example, prescribers cannot use SPL to do things like enroll in a REMS, prescribe drugs, or monitor patients. They can use SPL, however, to learn about what the REMS requires. There is a related effort taking place, the REMS Platform Standards Initiative, that is designed to develop standards that can capture and exchange that kind of information. And I won't be talking about that today, but our REMS integration website includes more information about that initiative. So what's in REMS SPL? When REMS SPL is submitted to FDA, or when any REMS is submitted to FDA, we're actually receiving two different kinds of documents. The first is the REMS document, and that's the one that you see depicted on the left. This is a short document that describes the goals of the REMS, what the sponsor's responsibilities are under the REMS, and overall summarizes how that REMS program works. But in addition to that, we're also receiving appended materials that are used to help facilitate the activities that are described in the REMS document. They can include things like educational material, brochures that patients may need to read, or prescribers, forms that need to be filled out, letters to healthcare providers, and other related material. So REMS SPL is the format that's used primarily to capture that first type of document, the REMS document. However, even though it doesn't capture REMS material directly, it does provide links and references to that appended material to make it easier to find and easier to integrate into the healthcare system. And again, I'll be describing a little bit more how that works in a bit more detail bit. So if you actually open up an SPL file in your web browser, this is what you might see. And what you're looking at here is part of the SPL called the REMS summary that provides succinct, readable, standardized information about what REMS with elements to assure safe use, or ETASU, require of participants. So this is what you would see if you opened up your browser. But if you actually go behind the scenes and look at the underlying code, this is actually what the REMS SPL really looks like. And the real power of SPL actually lies in this code. This is structured, codified, computer-readable information that's readily exchanged and integrated throughout the healthcare system. All of this structure helps facilitate that exchange and the kind of integration of the healthcare system that we think SPL can help achieve. So the goal of the presentation for today is to help explain the role that SPL can play in making REMS information easier to understand, more accessible, and better integrated into the healthcare process. So I'm going to spend some time talking about each of those things. And I'll start with how SPL makes REMS information easier to understand. So to start thinking about how this works, it's useful to think about how REMS with elements to assure safe use, which are the focus of much of our REMS efforts to make REMS easier to understand, how they tend to work. Elaine introduced them at the previous discussion, so I'll go over this really quickly to go into a little more by stakeholder, how the different participants in the REMS carry out their activities in REMS with elements to assure safe use. Now, I'd start by noting that every REMS works differently. The risks they are very different, the settings in which they're used are very different, but that said, there are certain commonalities. On the part of prescribers, there's often a requirement to complete training. They often need to complete some sort of enrollment form and thereby become certified to prescribe. They're often asked to counsel and educate their patients. They often need to make sure that patients agree to participate in the REMS and enroll them if necessary. So you might have prescribers enrolling patients so that you've got two parties enrolled. You then may need to, as a prescriber, assess or monitor your patients to make sure that certain what we call safe use conditions are present. And then on the part of dispensers and pharmacists, they're often asked to complete training, to complete an enrollment form, much like the one that the prescriber needs to complete to become certified to dispense. And then before dispensing, they're often asked to go back and check and make sure that those safe use conditions have actually been met. For example, that the prescriber was certified, that the patient was enrolled, and that the necessary monitoring had been completed. And then even because we need to make sure that only certified dispensers receive the drug, there's often a role for distributors in REMS to make sure that those dispensers are certified to dispense before they get the drug shipped to them. So these are all common components that you see across a really wide range of REMS. No matter what risks they're addressing, you see a lot of these in REMS with elements to assure safe use. So the real challenge there is that there isn't as much standardization of how the REMS are described. There's a variety of different ways that REMS are described, and it can make requirements and what's required of a stakeholder a bit unclear. The format of the documents and the materials can vary. Terminology can be inconsistent somewhat from REMS to REMS. And then there's often description of REMS using regulatory terms like ITASU, communication plan, elements A through F. These are all terms that many of you listening today may be familiar with, but healthcare providers and others are often less familiar with these terms and can find them confusing. Overall, what we heard in our previous discussions with participants in REMS is that it's not always easy to quickly and easily find out what's expected of them when they're using a REMS. So REMS SPL tries to address this by introducing a new method of describing REMS that we call the 4 Ws, and that is breaking down what the REMS is asking of its participants into these 4 categories, the first being who, or that is the stakeholder. So the who of the REMS is what party needs to meet the REMS requirement. For instance, is it a requirement that needs to be done by the prescriber, by the dispenser, by a healthcare setting, maybe by a patient? When is the second W of the REMS, and that's the stage in the treatment process when a REMS activity might occur. So that can be during prescribing, dispensing, the administration of the drug. It could happen before or after any of those events. And it could also happen at the initial certification stage before you're able to start using that REMS drug. The third W of the REMS is the what. These are the clinical or administrative activities that need to be performed as part of the REMS. And I mentioned both clinical and administrative because while the core goals of the REMS are to make sure that the drug is being used safely, there's often some administrative forms that need to be filled out in order to do that, like enrollment forms. But in addition to that, you want to know whether there are lab tests that need to be done, whether patients need to be counseled, or any other requirement that you need to meet at a particular time. And then finally, the last W is with what. And this is a reference to any approved REMS material with which the requirement is carried out. So I mentioned before that REMS come in the form of both a REMS document and appended materials. The with what is that reference to the appended material that can help you carry out the requirement, whether that's a form or some sort of educational material. So in REMS SPL, these 4 Ws are used to transform the requirements that participants in the REMS have to meet that are described in the REMS document into what we call REMS summaries. And you can actually see what a REMS summary looks like here. This is the REMS summary presenting the 4 Ws of the REMS in a tabular, easy-to-read format. And along the top, you'll see the who of the REMS, healthcare providers who prescribe drug X in this case. Along the left, you'll see the when of the REMS. So there are certain activities that have to take place in order to become certified. There are other activities that need to take place before the treatment begins. And then along the right side, you'll see the what and with what. So the what are the different steps that they need to do at each of those times. The review, whether it's reviewing certain educational material, enrolling in the REMS, counseling patients. The with what are the materials that are actually used to carry out those activities. So you enroll using that highlighted in blue Drug X REMS enrollment form, that's the with what, or you counsel the patient using the Drug X REMS counseling material. So these REMS summaries are included in every REMS that has elements to assure safe use that is in SPL format, and each REMS summary will have multiple tables, one for each participant in the REMS. So that's how SPL makes REMS information easier to understand. Now I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about how SPL can help make REMS information more accessible, more readily available. So right now, REMS information is made public when it's posted on our website, REMS@FDA. And while we are very proud of our website and we'd like to encourage you to visit it, we know that there are a lot of other sources that patients and healthcare providers use to get drug information. And the good news is SPL is designed around being disseminated to a wide range of those sources already. SPL, which is already being used for drug labels, is made available across the healthcare system. And we're hoping that as REMS gets put into SPL format, that information about REMS can be made available in the same way that labeling information is made available. And so this diagram shows exactly how that information flows. It starts when a sponsor submits their REMS to FDA in SPL format. Right off the bat, that REMS information can go into one of two places. It goes into actually two places. First of all, we capture that information for display and sharing with the public at REMS@FDA. Second of all, it goes into a repository run by the National Library of Medicine called DailyMed. And that DailyMed provides downloadable files that include the structured SPL information that is then downloaded by healthcare information suppliers. They capture that information in their drug databases, which they then provide to health IT systems vendors. So if you're using an electronic health record, if you're using a pharmacy system, you're actually getting that SPL information through this pathway, and it's being made available to you as you're carrying out your prescribing or dispensing of the drug. That pathway is used, as I mentioned, currently for labeling, and with REMS information being entered in SPL format, we expect that same pathway can be used to provide information to healthcare providers and patients in a more readily accessible and widely available and better integrated format. And so that means that for the first time, we're going to actually really be able to unite labeling and REMS information. I mentioned that REMS SPL files will be available in DailyMed. I want to provide one caveat about that. DailyMed actually provides labeling and other SPL information in two formats. First, as a viewable label that ordinary healthcare providers and patients can see formatted nicely on their screen. If you type into that search bar on that DailyMed website, you'll be able to see those labels. There's another format in which that information is also made available on DailyMed, and that is as downloadable files, and these are the files that are actually used by health IT developers and drug databases to incorporate the SPL information into their systems. So right now, you can look at labeling information using both of those formats, but right now REMS information in DailyMed will only be available as those downloadable files. So it's really the primary audience of the DailyMed site is for those health IT systems and those drug database vendors to be able to pull down that data. And the reason for that is that we expect that normal users who want to learn more about the REMS programs themselves will go to our REMS website, REMS@FDA. And in fact, REMS@FDA is going to be using REMS SPL information to display and capture the data that's available to the public. So not only are we reviewing the SPL data, we're actually using it and providing that information to the public. In the past, in fact, we've had to employ a team of analysts to manually go through the REMS documents that were submitted to us and enter in a lot of the data that you would see today on the REMS@FDA website. But thanks to the structured information found in SPL, the website will now be automatically populated with the data that's found in that SPL file. And you can see that on the screen here. we publish on REMS. This is a screenshot from our REMS at FDA website, and we publish for each REMS then a lot of details about each REMS program: the name of the drug, the NDA number, the dosage form, the approval date, the REMS elements, and then if you click on any of those REMS, you'll get much more detail about what is required of different participants in the REMS, what materials are attached to the REMS. Right now, that information has, up to this point, been entered manually. SPL allows us to automatically capture and display that information, and that gives that's a really powerful tool for us and for anyone in the healthcare system who wants to have structured information, display REMS information however they see fit. So the third thing I mentioned is that SPL can help integrate REMS into the care process. And the way that works is, well, we've already talked about the REMS summaries. And these use the 4Ws model to help describe what's required of participants in REMS with elements to assure safe use. But in fact, the REMS SPL goes further than just providing REMS summaries. It actually captures that information in a standardized, structured data elements. So let's revisit that summary that we talked about earlier. As you remember, the top of the summary is the who of the REMS, and it describes what a stakeholder in the REMS needs to do in order to be able to meet the different REMS requirements. That top of the REMS summary is described also using a structured, standardized data element called the stakeholder data element. Likewise, the when of the REMS is captured using a data element called protocol. The what of the REMS is captured using a standardized data element called requirement, and the with what is captured using a document reference data element. And each of these data elements provide structured information that can help systems understand in a standardized, structured way what the REMS is requiring. So the stakeholder data element uses a standard terminology to describe the role of the participant in the REMS. Prescribers, dispensers, patients, distributors, and also other healthcare providers, for instance, nurses who treat patients who are taking the REMS drug. All of these are described using that stakeholder data element that describes the who of the REMS. The protocol data element describes the when of the REMS by identifying when activities occur in the medication use process. And I mentioned what kinds of things are captured in the when of the REMS. The data element just captures those in a standardized way, and it can also be combined with certain modifiers to specify when a requirement needs to happen. For example, before certification, after treatment initiation, 1 week after dispensing. All these nuances are captured in a standardized way that can be read by computer systems. And then finally, there's also the REMS requirement data element, and this uses a standard terminology to describe all the different kinds of clinical and administrative activities that stakeholders need to carry out, like enrolling in the REMS, counseling the patient, reviewing prescribing information, or getting lab tests or monitoring. And then finally, there's the document reference data element, and that identifies the material used to carry out the REMS activity. And in general, there are 3 types of materials that can be referenced in REMS SPL using this codified data elements. The first is the appended materials that are attached, typically as PDFs. Second, you can reference a URL in a REMS SPL file. Or third, you can reference an electronic data standard. For example, sometimes REMS information can be exchanged electronically using data standards that prevent people from having to print out or fax or email information back and forth. So that data standard can be referenced in the SPL. And I'll go in how all these data elements are used, I'll go into in a little bit. Just to show you, this is what it looks like behind the scenes in the code. You don't need to necessarily understand this, but note simply that for all of the text that people can read, there's code behind the scenes that makes this interpretable by computers and by healthcare systems. And then once you've actually codified all of that information, one of the other powerful things that SPL allows you to do is to display that in many different ways. This is what the structured data looks like if you were to load an SPL file in your web browser. But if, for instance, you wanted your electronic health record system to display that information differently, it could. All of the information is available to allow you to program your system to display it in whatever way is most relevant to you. And I should note at this point that the integration of REMS information into the healthcare system doesn't happen on its own. So SPL can provide the information that you need to integrate REMS into your systems in a very structured and user-friendly format, but to actually be able to integrate REMS into the healthcare system requires that institutions, software vendors, and others actually incorporate that information into their systems. And the good news is that we already see that happening even with REMS SPL, because it's an important part of being able to manage products that have REMS is to be able to incorporate it into your existing systems. And we're already seeing stakeholders go through REMS documents by hand and capture all of the relevant 4Ws of the REMS and incorporate it into their system. Our hope is that SPL can help make that process much simpler and help automate it, particularly as more and more new REMS come about and additional requirements are added. And so the scenarios that I'm about to explain to you here show you how that information might get used. I want to walk you through these. These are hypothetical scenarios that show how the structured data in REMS SPL can facilitate integration of REMS into the healthcare system. So let's start with a scenario that might be used for prescribers. So let's say you're a doctor and you're about to start a patient on a drug that has a REMS. And as a prescriber, you may not realize that the drug has a REMS, and this is a common issue with REMS, where you may be going to prescribe a drug, not realize it has a REMS, and then find yourself in a position where you have to carry out activities or where a patient is unable to access the drug right away. Fortunately, the prescriber's electronic health record in this hypothetical scenario contains SPL data. What this means is they can start looking at those structured data elements. Using the stakeholder data element, the electronic health record can tell that the prescriber has a role to play in this REMS and can notify the prescriber of that fact. They can look at the data in the protocol and requirement data elements that I described before to tell the prescriber what steps they have to take when they're, for instance, initiating therapy with the patient, perhaps noting that they need to provide the patient with certain counseling materials. And then finally, that document reference data element can allow the electronic health record to present a copy of that counseling material to the prescriber to print and give to the patient. So the SPL information, by being structured, can be integrated into systems to provide relevant information when it's needed to help support the process of taking care of a patient who is using a REMS drug. Another example of how SPL can be used in the healthcare system is on the side of pharmacists or dispensers. So in this hypothetical scenario, imagine that you're a pharmacist and you're about to fill a prescription for a drug that has a REMS. And you're aware, perhaps, that a REMS exists for that drug, but perhaps the pharmacist is not aware that the REMS has recently changed. Fortunately, the pharmacist's pharmacy system contains that structured SPL data. So by taking a look at the protocol and requirement data elements, that pharmacy system can note that the pharmacist must now confirm that a specific lab test result be on file before they can dispense the drug. And the system can go even further than that. Using the document reference data element, the pharmacy system can learn that the lab or test results can be requested electronically. Remember that one of the things that you can reference in SPL is electronic data standards. Thanks to that trigger that SPL provided, the pharmacy system can then, using that data standard, check with the REMS program to determine whether that negative lab test is on file. And as a pharmacist, you don't necessarily need to know that this is all happening behind the scenes. The SPL information itself is powering these automatic checks and triggers that allow the REMS to be seamlessly integrated into your system and allows you to carry out the REMS requirements more effectively and efficiently. And again, I'd like to note that the things that I described before in these examples, these don't happen automatically. They'll require a couple of things to happen. First of all, they're going to require sponsors to continue to submit REMS in SPL format so that we have a repository of REMS out there that healthcare systems can draw upon. And they'll also require healthcare institutions and systems developers to start making use of this data in their tools. The good news is we already see a lot of this happening with SPL for labeling, and we're optimistic that it will continue to happen for REMS. And we do hope that these examples show you why it would be so valuable for REMS SPL to start getting incorporated into these systems and the power that SPL has to make REMS data more useful, accessible, and integrated. So with that, I wanted to talk about a little bit about next steps for our initiative to capture REMS in SPL format. Sponsors are, as of now, able to submit their REMS in SPL format. And when those REMS SPL files are approved, they will be made available on DailyMed. And on that note, I am very pleased to announce that we will be soon publishing the very first REMS in SPL format, and it will be made available on DailyMed. So I'd like to specifically call out and thank Indivior for taking this very important step with their REMS for Suboxone and Subutex. And I'd also like to congratulate Indivior for being the first of what I hope are many sponsors who convert their REMS into SPL format to make their REMS information more accessible and better integrated. For those sponsors who do wish to take that step, we are available at the website on the screen, FDA REMS website at fda.hhs.gov, to help REMS SPL submitters with their submissions. We are also preparing a draft guidance under FD&C 745A that would require REMS submissions to come in SPL format. That requirement would take effect 2 years from the publication of the final guidance, so there's still plenty of time to learn more about REMS SPL and to think about how you would incorporate your REMS into SPL, and we're here to help you with that if you're a sponsor who's interested in doing that. We're also going to continue to have opportunities for stakeholder feedback through the guidance process prior to issuing any final guidance requiring submission of REMS information in SPL format. So with that, this slide shows some resources for more information about SPL and for more information about our broader REMS integration initiative of which SPL is a part. So with that, thank you for your time. I'll now turn it over to Ray to introduce the Q&A.
Our thanks to you, Adam, and to our audience. We'll now take a short 10-minute break and we'll resume at 2:06 Eastern Standard Time, at which time we'll address your questions. Please take this.
Hi, this is Adam Kroetsch again. So thank you everybody for all of your thoughtful questions. So I'll try to go through as many as I can. So starting with, how is SPL information transmitted to stakeholders? This was covered a little bit in one of our earlier slides. We expect that information to reach stakeholders in a lot of different ways, but it starts from probably 2 major places. First, REMS SPL information will be made available on FDA's REMS website, REMS at FDA. And second, it will be made available on DailyMed. The DailyMed information is primarily geared towards use by healthcare IT vendors and data providers who then can integrate that information into their respective systems. So I think for the typical healthcare provider, many of you will find that information more available to you without really even accessing that SPL directly. You'll see it in your systems thanks to the integration into your systems that was done through that DailyMed data. The next question. What evaluation is FDA doing to assess the effectiveness of transmitting SPL REMS information to stakeholders? Do prescribers access this information or even know it is available? So I mentioned at the end of our presentation that we actually just recently received our first REMS SPL file, which we'll be putting on DailyMed very soon. And so our hope is that after we have more SPL files out there and the opportunity for healthcare providers to start using them, that we can start looking towards understanding better how that information is being used and how we can help encourage the incorporation of that data into the healthcare system and make sure that prescribers actually have access to it. But we're certain that prescribers will have access to it through our website, again, REMS at FDA. So at the very least, you'll be able to see it there. The next question. Are companies creating the REMS summaries, or is FDA creating them? It's a timely question. In general, we expect the companies to be developing the REMS summaries. However, for a limited time, as we get the SPL initiative started, we are willing to create REMS summaries for companies who request them. So if you're interested in submitting a REMS in SPL format, and you email us at that FDA REMS website email address, we can provide you with a summary of your REMS. And then again, that is only a limited time offer. Next question. If prescribers are not required to be certified, how would they know about a REMS? So this is actually one of the challenges that REMS SPL was designed to help address. Right now, there are two major routes by which you might know that there's a REMS. First is you might find out through, say, the normal ways that you receive news about drugs and drug approvals. And you might also find out from the sponsor themselves. In many cases, when a REMS product is released, the sponsor's representatives will have information about the REMS program. And then a third way that you actually might already be able to learn about whether a REMS exists is if there is information available. There will be information available on our website, REMS at FDA. But if in the future, with REMS SPL available, we expect that information will more and more be available from within your electronic health records, from within your pharmacy system, from within your smartphone applications, or any other tool that you're using to look up drug information. And that would be information that might be available regardless of whether or not your prescriber is required to be certified. The next question, is the sponsor responsible for ensuring that all healthcare providers, pharmacists, are certified and enrolled in the REMS? For REMS that do require pharmacy certification and enrollment or other forms of healthcare provider certification and enrollment, it would be the sponsor who is responsible for ensuring that that happens, yes. The next question, is there a target date for the finalization of the guidance for REMS and SPL format? Unfortunately, it's hard to put a precise date on finalization of the guidance, but we are actively working on it. And it would be, again, a reminder, 2 years after the final guidance. So there's both a draft guidance and a final guidance. We're working on the draft guidance right now, and it's 2 years after the final guidance is released that any requirement would take effect. The next question. Is the SPL format only for ETASU, Elements to Assure Safe Use programs, or can it apply to MedGuide communication plan programs as well? And a couple of people asked about this. So the REMS SPL can also apply to MedGuide and communication plan programs. The difference is the REMS summaries that I described and those REMS data elements that go along with the summaries are primarily geared towards REMS with Elements to Assure Safe Use. You'll still have structured data about the appended materials, so that fourth W, the with what, is present for the communication plan REMS, but those requirements, that information about the who, the what, and the when, and those different requirements that participants in the REMS need to meet is relevant primarily to REMS with Elements to Assure Safe Use. The next question. Once published on DailyMed, can you speak about any specific plans that healthcare system providers have for using the Suboxone's Subutex REMS? And again, I don't have any information to share right now on any specific plans that healthcare system providers have in place. But we do expect, as this information becomes available, that it will start getting used fairly quickly. We certainly saw that with labeling SPL, and we think that this information, because it travels along the same path and is in a very, very similar format, can get picked up using the same tools and incorporated into them. Next question. For applicants participating in a single shared REMS, who will be responsible for preparing the SPL file? Would it be the CMO representing all member companies or the individual applicants? So there are a number of different ways that shared system REMS can be submitted. Some companies who are participating in shared system REMS right now are submitting their REMS documents separately, each company submitting an identical REMS document, and others are submitting them jointly using a drug master file. SPL would follow the very same process that those companies are using right now. So if you're using a drug master file, you would have a single REMS SPL file submitted to FDA. If you were submitting multiple documents in parallel, those multiple documents would be submitted to FDA in SPL format. We'll be providing tools alongside the SPL to help people understand when there are multiple documents that are actually related to a single REMS. The next question, will the REMS SPL be made available on CDER Direct or on X-Forms? So We do use XForm. We do have XForms available to anybody who wishes to submit their REMS in SPL format as a tool to help you put that REMS in that format. You are also free to not use XForms if you prefer to use a different tool. Next question. Will the FDA be making communication plan REMS available in SPL? And as I mentioned before, that is going to be in SPL as well. You will not get the same summaries that you have for REMS with elements to assure safe use. Next question. If FDA currently requires applicants to publish approved labeling within 14 days of receiving approval, will FDA have the same expectation that REMS will be published to DailyMed within 14 days of approval? The answer to that is yes. We would expect the REMS to be submitted to us within 14 days of approval. There is a key difference, however, between REMS SPL and other SPL, labeling SPL, which is that we review every submission that comes in first before publishing it to DailyMed or to our website, just to make sure that all of the information has been captured accurately. But by and large, the process is very similar to the process that's used in labeling. I should also note that there was a previous, I think there are a lot of questions about the submission of REMS in SPL format. We did hold a webinar, I think it was last year, and you can find a link to it on the slide here that goes into much more detail on the processes and procedures for submitting REMS SPL. And in addition, we're happy to answer questions about the REMS SPL submission process at the FDA REMS website email address. So continuing with the questions, if a REMS requires training for the healthcare provider, how is that integrated in the system? Is the certification also tracked for administering the drug also referenced or tracked? So again, the integration of things like training and certification and the tracking of those things are not functions that the SPL can do on its own. What SPL gives you is the information about what kind of certification is required, how to find that information about that certification, what kind of training is required, and how to find information about training. The actual act of certifying, the actual work taken to train, happens outside of SPL within the systems that you're using, and it may vary from REMS to REMS. We are interested in finding electronic standards that can help facilitate training and certification, and that's part of another initiative that I've talked about before and that you can find more information about on our REMS Integration Initiative website. And that initiative is called the REMS Platform Standards Initiative. So just wanted to clarify, SPL is primarily for information about the REMS program. It doesn't necessarily help you carry out all those different REMS activities other than as an informational resource. The next question. How is the REMS SPL submitted? Through ECTD, through WebTrader? Is there a target for requiring REMS in SPL format? So I guess those are really two questions. The first question, how is the REMS SPL submitted? We would expect, if you intend to submit your REMS in SPL format, that you would, as a sponsor, that you would submit that through the ECTD as part of your application. Although we understand that sometimes the REMS comes in in other formats as well, including as a Word document to help facilitate review. That said, the format in which the vehicle through which you submit your REMS for publication on DailyMed is eList, which is the same tool that we use for publishing labeling data on DailyMed. Regarding whether there's a target for requiring REMS in SPL format, that's really going to depend on the timing of the guidances. So that draft guidance, followed by comments, followed by a final guidance, followed by a requirement taking effect 2 years after the publication of that final guidance. The next question, and unfortunately this is the last question we're going to be able to get to for the time being, or actually we may have a little more time. So the next question, and we'll try to get through a couple more questions. We don't have time for much more. So is the REMS template and XForms ready to be used? Are all the validation procedures finalized? The answer to that is yes, and we are able to accept REMS in SPL format. You can use X forms, and you can validate. All of the validation rules are in place to allow you to validate your REMS submissions. Okay, a couple more questions. Will the REMS SPL be a separate template form or template from the one currently used for approved drug label listing on DailyMed? So the answer to that is yes, it will be. It is a separate form or template. I mentioned earlier that the DailyMed formats all the labeling information and makes that accessible to anybody who wants to view the label within the DailyMed website. We currently don't have that set up to work that way for REMS. We expect people would find REMS information on our website, REMS@FDA. DailyMed for that is only providing the REMS information in as a downloadable SPL file, and that's a separate file from the files that labeling are contained in. Next question, and I do think this might be the final question we're able to get to today. Have done any testing with healthcare information providers to consume the SPL REMS? We have not done any testing as of yet, in part because we haven't actually published any SPL REMS, but we did take the feedback of healthcare information providers into consideration when we developed the data model and approach for SPL REMS. So we are hopeful that they will be able to make use of the information that's provided in SPL format. And we're also very interested in working with and hearing from any healthcare information providers who do wish to use the SPL REMS in the future to use that information. So we do hope to continue to work with healthcare information providers in the future. And with that, I think that's all the questions we have time for today. So I'll turn it over to Ray to close out.